Good afternoon, Saskia. I'm contacting you from Glasgow, Scotland, and today is the 15th of December 2021. So would you like to start off, Saskia, by telling us your full name and when you were born and where you were born?
Okay, so my name is Saskia Tepe. I was born in 1954, January the 31st, in Germany, in Fürth, which is in Bavaria, near Nurnberg. I was actually born in an orphanage. So there's a whole story as to how that came about. And I guess the way to tell that story of my birth is to start with my mum's story. She was born in what was later known as the Sudetenland, which is now Czechoslovakia, in an area near the Polish border. Place is now called Kurnov. Then it was called Jägendorf. She was born in 1915 during the First World War, and at that point it was part of the Habsburg Empire. There has to be a little bit of history explained so that you understand the situation that she was born into. After the war, 1918, she was 3 years old. Her mum passed away. And I suppose the biggest effect on her life was the fact that Czechoslovakia was created as a result of the end of the war. So her homeland was not the same. The Czechs started to rule what had been a German-speaking part of the empire. And over the years, there was a lot of acrimony, I guess is the word, against the Czechs ruling that part of her homeland. The border that she was on was with Poland, but so she could speak Polish, she could speak German, and she spoke Czech. Her father was a customs official. He was fairly well off, sort of middle class, but as a result of the war, inflation at the end, they lost a lot of their money. She told me a lot about losing everything, and this seemed to affect her life. She was mostly brought up by her grandmother, Cecily, who owned an inn about a mile away from where they lived, and her grandmother was Jewish. Her father was Catholic, and her mother had been Jewish but converted to Catholicism before she married. So it wasn't as though she changed her religion because of getting married. She just changed her religion. It was a common enough thing. Jewish people had been in that area, had kind of been allowed to integrate into normal society fairly early on in the 1870s, around that area. So it wasn't as though they were sort of isolated as in a lot of Russian areas and so on. There was quite an age difference between my grandmother and my grandfather, but unfortunately, even though she was so young, she died in 1918, strangely enough, of the pandemic, the Spanish flu.
The Spanish flu. Mm-hmm.
So my mum was brought up by a stepmother. She didn't get on too well with her. I guess there was some jealousy involved. So she spent a lot of time with her Jewish grandmother. By the time she was 23, when her war started, she was looking after her father who'd had a stroke. She was working as a bookkeeper. She was engaged to be married to a Catholic. I suppose life was reasonable. She was impressed by Hitler about what he promised, what he said he was going to do for the German people, for the Sudeten Germans. Unfortunately, as she told me, she didn't know what was going to happen. So, as part of the war starting, and for her it happened in 1938, because she was in the Sudetenland, and if you know your history, the Sudetenland was given by the Allies to Hitler to appease him, to stop war coming. So Hitler himself actually came to the town where she lived, Jägendorf, as part of that accession, I don't know what the word is. And she once told me that she had seen Hitler, which I thought was pretty amazing. When I found out that he had been there, it all kind of made sense, which brings me to a point that a lot of what she told me was memories, and they were mostly memories of her homeland and the songs that she sang, happy memories. I didn't know anything about what happened to her until I was 13. I didn't even know that she had been Jewish, brought up Jewish, raised Jewish initially, I guess, or what happened to her. So when I was 13 is when she told me this story that I'm about to tell you.
So she was engaged to
Yes.
a young man?
Yes, she was. And with the coming of the Nazis came their laws, including the Nurnberg laws that had been passed, which stipulated what Jews could and could not do, and stipulated how they, in a sort of pseudo-scientific way, how much pure Aryan blood you had in you, depending on your lineage, your parents and your grandparents. They went back to the grandparents because they knew people converted. My mother had to prove how much of a Jew she was by providing proof, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, etc. And it was established that she was a Mischling Jew, a mixed-race Jew, a mongrel, if you like, of the first degree, because she had two Jewish grandparents, her grandmother and her grandfather, who she hadn't known. And as such, she was given a pass with an indication that she was mixed race, Mischling, and she was subject to the laws, which included curfew, things like that they weren't allowed to have telephones, they weren't allowed to write diaries, they weren't allowed to travel on public transport, except for specific times. They were not allowed to go food shopping until after the good Germans had done their food shopping. And of course, rationing. I think the rationing was allocated how much of a Jew you were. For full-term Jews, if you like, it was about 500 calories a day, which if you put that into commonplace parlance, that would be about a Big Mac hamburger. And I read a diary by Victor Klemperer, who was a professor based in Dresden, who wrote in great detail about what happened to him during the war. According to him, most of what he ate was potatoes, because there wasn't much left in the stores, especially as the winters got harder and the war progressed. So it really was, starvation level. I think food was the main thing that was on people's minds during the war, probably German as well as Jewish. So the other thing, of course, was the fact that she was engaged to a German Catholic, and he was supposed to renounce her. In fact, it was illegal for them to marry, but he wouldn't give her up. So this was the words that she used. He wouldn't give me up, so they conscripted him into the army and sent him to the Eastern Front, and she never saw him again. It was very common for them, for the Nazis, the Gestapo, and people that were put in place, keep the regime going in a foreign country, for them to rely on people handing you over, I guess, saying, oh yes, she's Jewish, I remember her grandmother, and so on. And so it was a difficult time for her. There was a lot of a shame, she said, on her family, on her Aryan father, who had been respected. There was a lot of shame, the fact that, he now had a Jewish child, and yet at the same time she was protected by the fact that he was Catholic and a respected person. Even the Nazis didn't quite know how to deal with the Mischlings, because part of their parents were good German citizens, and they didn't want to put up barriers So in a way, she had it not too bad. I'm sure while she was living with him, she was given food and she was able to listen to the radio, so on. She had a better life than others. But unfortunately, her father died in 1943, and that's really when things got bad for her. With no one to protect her, she was sent to forced labor. The Nazi machine needed workers, and they used the Jews, they used the Poles, they used anybody that became prisoners of war to keep the war machine going. She was taken away from home, and she was put into a boarding house that had other Jewish people living in there. They liked to keep an eye on them in groups. And she had to get up every morning and go and stand in line, have the Gestapo member tell her where she was going to go and work. She told me once that an SS officer came to her room in the boarding house and beat her up. I don't know what the circumstances were. A friend of hers managed to get her to the line so that she could, apply for work on his bicycle. She couldn't walk, but she knew that if she didn't go and apply for work, they could possibly take her away on a transport. I should tell you that where she lived was, like I said, on the Polish border. It wasn't too far from Auschwitz. And I found a CV, a curriculum vitae, a resume, as the Americans say, that was made while she was trying to immigrate. And it stipulated where she had worked during the war years. And I found out from that she was working in Poland a lot of the time, not in Czechoslovakia. So wherever this boarding house was, it was in Poland. And I found out from the last place that she worked, a place called Kacher, that's about 60 miles from Auschwitz on a direct line, train-wise. She said that she never told me in detail. A lot of this piecing together of her story was done, after her death, when I found documentation and started to put the whole story together. But she told me that she worked in a factory and she was in the office as a bookkeeper. Excuse me. She was working as a bookkeeper, and it was part of her job to go on the local train to deliver money to different parts of this factory. So it must have been a huge area. And so she got to know the railway tracks and the routes and so on, and that this was how she survived the war, because she was eventually put on a train. I should tell you, before she was put on the train, a story that she did tell me this particular night when I was 13. She said she was lucky that she worked in the office. She was warm, at least. There was heating there. Her bunkmate, so having told me that she had a bunkmate, I figured out that she must have been living on site in this office. I imagine something like in Schindler's List, something like that, where the workers are on site in the factory. Her bunkmate's job was to clean the latrines. Well, the winters were terrible. That winter was really bad, that last winter. This must have been 1944 going to 45. And knowing that if you stopped working, that you could be shot or you would be put on a train to Auschwitz, faced with the choices of freezing to death, cleaning the latrines, or the other options, her bunkmate hanged herself. When my mum was telling me this,
terrible,
she was very matter of fact. I mean, I was 13, so what do I know about understanding, what that means? I kind of took it quite coolly as well at the time, but I'm good at that because a lot happened in my life, so I always I'm pretty cool and resourceful and, sit back and don't let things happen. I think about it afterwards and work out how I'm going to cope with that. And that's what happened at this particular time. So, continuing with the story, she was eventually put on the train to Auschwitz. And actually, that's, like I said, that's what saved her, because she knew the route. And she said that she jumped off the train. She knew where the deepest snowdrifts were, and she waited for her moment and took a leap of faith and jumped into a snowdrift. Now, at the time, I took all that on board, but afterwards, when I looked at the pictures of what happened during the war, all I saw was these huge cattle trains that transported, hundreds in a cart at a time, and I thought, how could she have jumped out of that? But then I saw pictures online. Like I said, I kind of pieced the story together. I saw pictures. They actually moved prisoners in open-topped, like, coal trucks with guards sitting on, keeping an eye on them. And I think this is what she was jumping out of. It's the only thing I could think where she had visibility of where she was, too. So she escaped into a snowdrift. I'm sure she wasn't the only one, though she never mentioned it. And then she had, you wonder how people think of these things. She decided that the safest place to be so that she wouldn't be captured or recaptured was to jump onto one of the trains that was taking wounded soldiers back to Germany. And to do this, she stole a nurse's uniform. She figured that if she was dressed as a nurse, that she would be safe, because nobody would ask for her papers. I mean, if you were on a train, people anywhere, you were identifiable. She thought that was the safest thing to do. And so she was on the train nursing until she got to Dresden, which, as the crow flies from where Kacher is about 100 miles. Or in kilometers, about 140 or something like that?
Something like that,
yeah. So when she got to Dresden, she decided to get off the train because she had relatives on her father's side that lived not too far from there. And she thought, she knew the war was ending. There was talk of the Russians were coming, that there would be liberation. The war, the Germans were losing. There was all that talk. Obviously, it was in secret. So she thought that maybe she could hide at her cousin's house if she would take her and be there for the end of the war. So she got off the train at the station in Dresden, and she was waiting for another train to come to go to Marienburg. She had a bad feeling, she said, that she just needed to get out of there. Now, and while she was waiting, she had befriended another girl, and they decided that they would walk together and see how far they could get that day. They left the train station and they walked, and they decided to spend the night in an empty barn, and were woken that night with bombing and fire in the distance, and that was the night that Dresden was bombed. She said that she felt God was looking after her, giving her the wisdom to leave the train station. Needless to say, the train station was totally bombed out. Dresden was one of the biggest bombings, even though the end of the war was coming, and was a huge number of Germans lost their life. I understand that's war, and there were decisions made to do that. She was lucky that she escaped. She basically had escaped with her life twice, and unfortunately it was not yet the end, even though the Russians were coming. You have to remember, my mom was German, first and foremost, and she was in Germany, and that was a bad place to be when the Russians were coming. She didn't talk about what happened to her. She just said that she was recaptured and put into another camp. And then after the war ended, she went back to her home. I think it was possibly to wait for her fiancé to come back. That was not a good place to go, because after the war, there was a lot of retaliation against the German-speaking people. The Czechs wanted retribution, and they didn't care whether you were Jewish or what you had gone through. As far as they were concerned, she was German, of German blood. They did not want any German blood on their soil, which is kind of what, the Germans had done to the Czechs. They didn't want any Czechs on their soil. It was retribution, simply put. So she was actually put into a camp, the same kind of camp that the Nazis had used. She was put into a camp and was there for 2 years until 1947. And then she was eventually transported, I'm not sure of the details, to Germany, because the Czechs had decided that they did not want any German blood on their soil. And so they cleared all the Germans out of these camps, whether they were on foot or on train. I don't know the details. She just said that she was taken back to Germany and she paid a black marketeer to make sure that she got to Western Germany. Remember, after the war, Germany was divided into the Russian area, and if she had been taken under the Russians, she didn't think she could handle that. I should say my mother had a lot of bad feeling toward Russian soldiers, and I did not know the reason for that. It wasn't until after she died, and I found some paperwork in a box, a lot of papers, her parents' birth certificates and so on, that I realized that she had had a baby in 1945. She didn't tell me anything about that, so I'm assuming that that she was probably raped. And the fact that it was the Russians that she did not like, I'm assuming it was the Russians. I know there was a lot of rape and pillage went on at the end of the war. And of course she was in Germany at that time, near Dresden. So for her, the war was a long one. It started in 1938 and it ended in 1947. But she was able to manage to get to Western Germany, and she was then put into a hospital because she was malnourished. She was sick. She had TB. She was kept there for 3 months until she was healed. And then she started her new life in Germany. She was given reparations money after the war. A lot of Jews, people that were affected by the Nazis, were given reparations money, and this was to help them start a new life because obviously they had lost everything. She had lost her home. She had nothing to go back for, and she wasn't wanted. Unfortunately, it was too late for her to emigrate, as a lot of Jewish people had done after the war. There's a lot of people that had ended up in Germany as a result of the war, foreign workers, migrant workers that had been brought there by the Nazis to work in their munitions factories and so on, slave labor. So she decided that she would have to make her life in Germany, and she used that money to go to school. She went to the university in Nurnberg. She ended up in Nurnberg, and she studied. She spent the money on studying. She was living as a refugee. She was counted as a refugee because she had been expelled basically from Czechoslovakia as a result of the war. I don't know much about her life other than, passes and so on. But so from that, I figured out where she had lived and discovered that it wasn't too far from the camp where I was born. And I guess now, finally, I come to my story. So I was born in 1954, which when you think that the war ended in 47, that was a good long time. It took her a long time to build up her life, I guess. She did work. She did work occasionally doing secretarial work. She had a degree in economics, but after the war, there was very little work, and especially not for refugees. She was designated a refugee. And she lived near a big, huge refugee camp on the outskirts of Nurnberg, which was mostly housed people from Poland, the Baltic areas. And she told me that's where she met my father. And this was the story that she told me. I always assumed my father was the man that she had married. I didn't realize that there was a whole secret involved. And this was told to me when I was 13, when she told me this story, her story basically, very briefly. And I discovered that the man that I had been raised by was not my father. She told me what had happened to her was she had met my father, who was seemingly Czech, and then living in this refugee camp on the outskirts of Nurnberg. And they had wanted to get married. They had tried to emigrate together to the US. There was always a hope of emigration, but there were limited numbers that were taken by countries across the world. I found a lot of papers where she had applied for immigration. So they had met, they had fallen in love, they were trying to emigrate, they had gone through the whole process, which is a long process for immigration. It's like a 2-year process. And unfortunately, when she got to the medical, which is the very last thing that you do, they discovered she had TB at the medical. So she had to stay behind and get it cured. They wouldn't take somebody with TB. Mm-hmm. So the agreement was that he would carry on and go to the US, and that once she was cured, she would go to a sanatorium, take the cure. Once she was cured, she would reapply and follow. But it wasn't until she was in the sanatorium undertaking the cure that she discovered that she was pregnant. And the reason they didn't know that she was pregnant was actually a result of the starvation that people had undergone. Women, it affected their periods. So she didn't actually realize that she was pregnant until she was 5 months gone with me, and discovered this in the sanatorium, which was a bit of a shock for her, I guess. Was certainly a shock for him.
I presume she would also, absolutely, and I presume she would be very thin as well. So
she was, yes.
It would just, yeah.
Yeah, took a long, I have pictures of her, and you can see how thin she is after the war. And when you have TB, you're not a well person.
No.
And I think she had bouts of it. They didn't have a cure for it at that point. You just underwent a period of, rest. And once you were cleared by the doctors, then you were okay to carry on. So that's what she was hoping for, that, I guess, when she went into the sanatorium, that there would be a future with him. But unfortunately, there wasn't to be, because she was pregnant. She would never have been taken as an immigrant by the Americans or anybody else, come to that matter, as a pregnant woman or as a single mother, because in those days that was a shame. It was a shameful thing to have an illegitimate child. So really, her life choices were limited yet again. All this hope for immigration failed. So she decided that she was going to have to make her life in Germany because she wanted to keep me. I was put into an orphanage to begin with when I was born, and I was in that orphanage until I was 3. In those 3 years, my mother met a Pole, and they made an agreement. This is what she told me. It was a marriage of convenience. They decided to get married. He, because he needed a wife. He had suffered under the Nazis as well. And she would marry him to look after him, be a wife to him, as long as he would take me on as his child, and she could get me out of the orphanage. So for her, it was a marriage of convenience.
Can I just ask why you were in an orphanage for 3 years? Was it because your mother couldn't keep you, or was it because TB?
Well, initially it was TB. She was still in the sanatorium. I was born in the sanatorium. There's a funny family story where she took me to that place where I was, the sanatorium where she was, in Sudeten Germany. And we were walking up the stairs, and she sort of pointed like this and said, "This is where you were born." And I thought I was born on the staircase.
It's a bit...
Yeah, so there you go. Children sometimes misunderstand their parents,
Absolutely.
don't they? But that was a story that we like to tell afterwards. It was when I told her what I had understood by it. So yes, she couldn't look after me. She was very sick. And that's why I was put into the orphanage. And then a single parent in those days was a no-no. It's not like what happened a lot in those days is if there was an illegitimate child born, the grandparents raised it as a sibling. That was often the way that they handled it. Well, my mother didn't have anyone. Her father had died. She was rejected by her stepmother, so she was on her own, and she couldn't have me. She couldn't raise me. She needed to get married to be able to get me out of that orphanage. And so this marriage of convenience opportunity came along, and she took it. And it was an agreement that they made, that she would be his wife and look after him and feed him. He'd already been married before. He was a widower, and he would allow her to take me out of the orphanage, and I was going to be raised as part of the Piekiewicz family. And so it was. At 3 years old, I met my father, as I thought he was. And unfortunately, a lovely family unit didn't last very long because he got TB. And for health reasons, we were living in the refugee camp on the outskirts of Nurnberg. As a family unit, it was dangerous for a child to live in with parents who had, or one parent or another had TB. So I was actually fostered out away from the family, and at 3.5, I spent 6 months with my new parents, and I was fostered, sent to Switzerland for my health. I wasn't a healthy child. I had a lot of bronchitis and so on, and I think they were worried that I was going to get pneumonia. So I was sent to the Alps for the fresh air, and after 6 months, I came back hale and brown and plump, and my mother was so impressed by what had happened that after I'd been home with her for 6 months, she decided that the conditions were better with foster families than they were in the camp. So she fostered me out again, this time to a Belgian family. And so I went for another 6 months, and I came back with wonderful new clothes and happy stories to tell her and so on. And she had me home for another 6 months. Then she decided that I needed to go back there. And one of the reasons was it wasn't that she was necessarily sick or he was necessarily sick when I was there or not there. Some of it was purely so that she could go out and work while he was sick and, make some extra money. Because living in the camp, was borderline. You were basically living on charity. The camp was run by the United Nations, and the Catholic Church was the kind of lifeblood of it. And this fostering was organized by the Catholic Church. So it ensured that I had a good life, at least, or as good a life as I could have, while they were still trying to get immigration papers, and move out of that camp. The camp in 1960 housed something like 4,000 people. So you can imagine the conditions, rife with TB. They hadn't got a cure. The only cure was to go into a sanatorium. And my father, the man I thought was my father, he was in and out of the sanatorium several times that I remember. I remember meeting him on the train station when he was coming home, and saying goodbye to him on the train station when he had to go back in. So application for immigration was never going to be successful until he was cured. They had to do that. And in the meantime, she would go out to work. So that was a life. In the meantime, I had a wonderful time in Belgium, being raised by these wonderful people, embraced by all their friends and family. And for me, life was pretty good. I was pretty happy. I had no real idea of the hardship that the refugees went through in these camps, these huge camps. There were refugee camps all throughout Germany, throughout Europe, France, Greece. We were actually lucky that the United Nations pulled some strings, if that's the word to use, and actually managed to get some countries to reopen their borders and take more refugees from the Second World War. And so we were very lucky, and one of our applications was successful. We applied to the UK, which was successful. We had to undergo a 2-year period for application, so the process started in 1959, and in 1961 we were one of 700 families that was taken by the United Kingdom under the World Refugee Year that was sponsored by the United Nations. And so we were able finally to leave the refugee camp in Nurnberg and go to the United Kingdom. That camp closed in 1968.
It's
So it's a
incredible.
long time after the war.
Mm-hmm.
Thank goodness for the internet. I've actually been in touch with some of those people that lived in the camp. Not in my era, some of them were later. And that's been an interesting experience, meeting up with these people and hearing their stories. There we were, 1961, a new life. Finally, we had managed to get away from Germany, to begin a new life. Of course, we couldn't speak the language. What happens when you're a refugee? You spend some time in one of their homes that was run by the British Council for Aid to Refugees, as it was known then, and they give you the basics of living in an English-speaking country, some basic English, going shopping. Can I have a pound of meat? Can I have a pound of mince? And of course, the cuts of meat are different. The vegetables were different. It's a big learning curve when you come into a country and you can't speak the language. They give you the rudiments of English and the rudiments of what to expect. And they also set you up with your initial home. I mean, the Council for Aid to Refugees, which is still, it's now called the Council for Aid to Refugees, not the British Council anymore, but it still exists, and it still looks after people that come from war-torn countries, refugees worldwide, and resettles them, and that's what it was. It was a period of resettlement for us. We eventually, after 6 months induction, 3 months induction, we were relocated to Hitchin in Hertfordshire, England, and my father was found job with Harkness Roses. It's a very well-known company that grows roses outdoors. So for his TB, which he had recovered from, this was perfect outdoor work for his lungs. My mum did some sewing for people. We were given a home to live in that was sponsored by a teaching association, I guess is what you would call it, teaching association. They sponsored our family. They raised money to furnish a house. With the job, we were able to pay the rent and so on. And we started to try to integrate into British society, English society, which was hard work for somebody who doesn't speak the language. My father, who wasn't particularly gifted with languages, found a home. We were sent to Hitchin in Hertfordshire because there was a big Polish community. My stepfather was Polish. So that's why we were moved there and tried to integrate into this area. So he had, he had a group of people that he could associate with. My mother, of course, was German, German speaking. And when it came out that she was German speaking, she had a difficult time becoming integrated in this Polish community because, of course, the Poles had suffered greatly under the Nazis. And as far as she was concerned, she had been a Nazi. She didn't tell people about her Jewish heritage and what had happened to her because it was a source of shame. I mean, the Jews were never that well liked by the Germans or by the Poles. I mean, it was something that she kept secret. Of course, my stepfather knew about it, but it was not shared. He knew about that when he took her on, and the marriage of convenience was arranged. So she was kind of ostracized. He started to drink a lot. the life that they had hoped for was not forthcoming. She had planned a future for us. This was going to be a wonderful opportunity for us to leave all that horrible history behind and make a new start. His drinking got worse. He drank the money that he earned, which wasn't, a great amount of money. So she decided that she would have to go to work. And what could a woman do in those days? Not very much, other than go into service, especially women who spoke such little English. So luckily for us, in a nearby town, there was a small stately home called the Berry, and it was run by a colonel and a lady, and they were willing to take on my mom as housekeeper. They needed a housekeeper. And so she moved in. She lived on site, and she wasn't going to leave me behind. So I moved in with her. We had our own apartments. It was very posh. My mom thought it was wonderful that now, all of a sudden, she had this well-to-do life. She had her own sitting room where the butler brought her tea. It was something out of Downton Abbey. It was not quite on that scale, but for her it was wonderful, and she enjoyed being there, and I thought it was like fairyland. I could go into all the bedrooms and pretend I was a princess, and while she was making the beds and so on. At that point I was like 9 years old, so for me it was a fairy tale, but unfortunately for her it was hard work. And of course, when it came out amongst the other staff that I don't know if they found out that she was Jewish, but the fact that she was German there was not a good thing. It was difficult for her to make friends that accepted her for what she was. She was always going to be labelled German and therefore Nazi, and that's the way it was. I understand it. I'm sure she understand it. Did it make her bitter? I think she tried not to be. She was very hardworking, and she had me. She had me to look after. And if you think about what had happened to her in her life, the fact that I came along and she had a child after this terrible life and this terrible afterlife, after the war life, she had something to live for. I was her life. We left there after a few months. She managed to get a job as a housekeeper for an old gentleman, which was great because then she was by herself. She could look after him, and we had the comforts of a home. She had already decided, or her husband had already decided, that the marriage was over and had found himself a new lady friend. So there was the beginnings of a divorce in the future. In the meantime, she continued working and raising me. She decided that she would try for nurses training. Her English improved. She thought she was capable of doing that. So we moved. She had several jobs. She started working in a hospital. I think this is what gave her the idea. And we moved to Papworth near Cambridge. And she became a student nurse there. Unfortunately, you have to remember, by then my mom was in her 50s. So this was tough going for her. So she got sick and she couldn't continue her studies. So then we asked for help from the British Council for Aid to Refugees, because she couldn't look after me and she couldn't look after herself. And we moved back to where we had started in the UK, which was down in the south coast, Worthing, the kind of reception area where we had first gone and learnt the rudiments of English. And we were housed by the Council for Aid to Refugees. She gradually worked her way back to health and started working again. But, it was all low-paying jobs. Yes, we got help from the British Council for Aid to Refugees. But on the whole, between jobs, we managed to survive independently. By the time I was 16, we had moved 12 times, I think it was. I had gone to 3 different schools. I don't know how many jobs my mum had, low-paying jobs. But, we were happy. We were together. This was the main thing. She had a life. She had me to look after. Everything was invested in me. Unfortunately, of course, when you're a teenager, that becomes a bit of a burden.
I was just going to ask two things is because you talk a lot about how it affected your mother, but I think for you as well as a child to go through all that, it's quite, that's really traumatic for you as well. I think sort of living in different being in orphanages, being fostered in different countries, backwards and forwards, moving cities, moving different places. That must
Yes,
have had
I was aware that I was different. Well, we were both different. Not being able to speak the language was always going to be a mark on her. I mean, her English did become perfect, but she never lost her accent, so she was always a foreigner. I, on the other hand, nobody knew that I was foreign. I changed my name, tried to integrate. You knew you were different, so you tried desperately not to be, I think, is the way I would put it. I spoke perfect German. There's even a little clipping in the local newspaper about the refugees, my mom and I, and my stepfather, and the fact that after a year I could speak perfect English. Integration for me was important, but I knew that I was always going to be different. And that leaves a scar. And when you become a teenager, it's a bigger scar because you don't want to be different. So was there shame? I guess I was a little bit ashamed of my mom, but how could I be ashamed of her because, she had gone through this terrible life. I didn't even know about it till I was 13. But that was a big burden to... Why? Why did she tell me?
Tell you
So why
13?
did she tell me when I was 13? It was when we moved back to Worthing to this house that was housed refugees. And we discovered our neighbour upstairs was German. So my mum introduced herself to her when she moved in. And my mum discovered that, yes, she was German, but she had been a Nazi. There was this assumption by this lady that my mother obviously must have had some Nazi feelings. And she told her that she had been the wife of the commandant of a camp. Now, I didn't ever find out what kind of camp it was. I mean, it could have been a labor camp. I mean, I dread to think. I don't know. All I know is I was sitting downstairs. My mother came downstairs into the living room, and she was in a terrible state, and not crying, not just kind of displaced, staring off into the distance. I guess remembering, because after all this time, she had put all that behind her. She'd never told me anything about her history or what happened to her during the war. I would never have thought to ask. I never, I was 13 years old. Why would you ask a thing like that? So she told me that this lady had been, and then she told me her secret. I guess having gone down the path of memory, she felt that she had to tell me what had happened to her. And this is when she told me about my past. This is when she told me about her past, her Jewish background. And it was the first time that I'd ever heard of the fact that she had suffered. I mean, I knew a little at 13. What do you know about the Second World War? Very little. So I kind of took it on board, but I had to find out what it was all about. I realized this terrible suffering that she must have gone through. I mean, the images that they shared then of the war were the concentration camps and the fact that she'd, been in one or could have been in one and gone through this. Imagine how that affects you when as a 13-year-old you discover this about these secrets. It was like she had this whole life that I never knew about. So I took on a big burden then because I realized that she'd had this terrible life and I had to make sure that she was happy. Well, when you're 13 and just starting to become a teenager, that's difficult. So I was always very guarded and reserved around her and tried to make her happy and so on. And by the time I was 16, 17, 18, I couldn't wait to get away. You know, it was, and that brings you a big feeling of guilt as a child, you know. So, yeah, it was the first opportunity I had, really, is I got away. And it was a shame because she had invested all this love and life, her life, in me. And then suddenly it was my responsibility to make her happy, which is very difficult for a child, for a teenager. So, yeah, it took me a long time to get over that. And in fact, it was kind of repressed. All I needed to do was basically to get away. So, of course, at 18, I met my husband-to-be. He was Scottish. I moved to Scotland. I was so happy to unburden myself from this responsibility that I felt I had to keep my mum happy, which I feel, you know, bad about and felt increasingly bad about. But how do you cope, you know, as an adult and bringing up children and trying to keep your mum happy? You know, I think all married children deal with that responsibility in one way or another, right? So for me, it was kind of repressed. And it wasn't until after she passed away that I had a bit of an issue with it and had a nervous breakdown when I looked through all the papers that she had, and I realized, for a start, that she'd had a baby at the end of the war in 1945. I mean, that devastated me because I thought, well, you're right. I felt so guilty. I thought I had done the best that I could have for her. I mean, she was happy living in England, even though I was in Scotland. She'd made friends. Her life had settled down. She had a normal retirement, if you like, looking after her health. She joined a church. She was part of a community. She had friends. I thought her life was good, you know, given what she'd endured. And then I discovered that there was more to it. And then I thought, well, why on earth didn't she tell me all this? Was I that bad a child that she couldn't share these things with me? So eventually I had some counseling, bereavement counseling after she passed away. I think that her life, you know, was happy. I think she had a happy ending to her life. By then I had 2 children, and she got to spend time with her children. In her last year, I moved her up to Scotland when she was getting frailer, and I realized that, you know, her health, she had managed to look after herself so long. She was careful about her health. I didn't tell you, when I was 17, she had a heart attack. I mean, she had a heart attack in her mid-50s. And this was all as a result of, you know, the war years and malnutrition and so on. You know, a lot of the guilt was the fact that I left her. I couldn't cope with all that responsibility. I don't know if I think she understood. You know?
I think, Saskia, you were a wonderful daughter. Really. And, you know, you took on a huge amount, and you were a child.
Yes. Yes.
She got to know your children, as you said, which was lovely.
Yes.
And, you know, you looked out for your mother a lot.
The last 6 months of her life, I think, even though she was, you know, slowly dying, she had heart failure, she got to spend quality time with her grandchildren. They were around there every day. She taught me all the things that I guess I missed out as a teenager, rebellious teenager that I was, or tried not to be. And, you know, at least we had that. It was the last good few 6 months.
I would like to thank you for telling your story and your mother's story. And I do think that you were a very special daughter. And I do hope that this hasn't upset you too much, because it is difficult, I think, reliving it. But you are a very special person, and you've written a book about your mother, and all the way through this testimony that you've given, it's always about your mother. But you are part of this as well, and really, I think you're quite exceptional.
Thank you.
And thank you very much
for listening to my story. Thank you.
Thank you. So tell me about your life now. So where are you? You're in America.
Yes.
And
so what happened was, and I suppose it's part of the story, is I don't think after my mum died, I had a bit of a nervous breakdown. My first husband didn't really understand, so the marriage kind of faltered. And my second husband that I met in 2000 is American. And so I'm now living in America. I'm living in Arizona in a wonderful retirement place. We get the best weather in the winter ever. It's just a wonderful place to live. Good fun. And my two sons from my first marriage, when we split up, my youngest son was about 13 and my oldest was 18. He started university. It was a kind of a tough single life, and then eventually I met my second husband, who's American, and now I live in the States. So life has been pretty good to me. All the things that I went through, I had a chance to come to terms with it. I wrote a book. I now talk about what happened to my mom and I, to keep those stories alive. Unfortunately, the people that I tell the stories to, it's strange. Politics in the US is a little bit awkward. There's kind of a disconnect between telling the story, and having people actually hear it, listen to it, and understand it. And they all think that I'm just wonderful, but I don't think they necessarily take on board what it is to be an outsider, what it is to be treated like an outsider, to be treated differently, to be labeled, etc., which is what I'm trying to tell the story. That's the reason I tell the story. What happens, when a country rises up against a people, it's crazy. And we've seen it a lot. It still goes on. You tell the story so that, people hopefully would learn a lesson, and some people do. And that's probably why I'll keep telling it.
Yeah. And am I right in saying that you have one son that lives in Scotland?
I have one son who lives in Scotland, in Glasgow, and I have one son who lives in Australia. So I always say when I give my talks is that Hitler may have tried to destroy us, but actually we are still spreading across the globe, and we are continuing to tell our stories. Because when I'm in Australia, I've been handing out books. When I'm in Scotland, I give talks. When I'm in the US, I give talks. And my story will go on. And I'm so grateful that Gathering the Voices is telling those stories and arranging for people to tell their stories. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.